Hello and welcome to my world. Today I'm going to show you my modified Tamiya Bull Head truck that I call Raging Bull, but this time I'm going to show you what it looks like with the body removed, so I can show some details about the chassis. And I'd also like to talk about some things that I forgot to mention in the first video that I did about this truck. So starting on top, this is a Novak NER2X 2-channel AM receiver, and this is a Novak Super Rooster electronic speed controller. Above the Super Rooster is a Novak ESC cooling fan, and this fan was originally designed to mount on top of the Novak Super Duty ESC, and this plastic mounting bracket that Novak supplies with the fan, this bracket is designed to be bolted directly on top of the Super Duty, but I managed to get it to fit around the sides of the Novak Super Rooster, and the Super Rooster is a little bit wider than the Super Duty, so I just spread these vertical walls of the mounting bracket, just spread them out a little bit, and then bolted the bracket down to the radio plate. And since the bracket is made out of plastic, it's very flexible, so I was able to do that without any problems. The radio tray is a machined aluminum tray that I bought off of eBay, and that's much nicer than the stock plastic Tamiya radio tray. All of the wiring on this truck is Dean's wet noodle 12 gauge wiring, and all of the connectors are Dean's ultra plugs. On the front and rear of the chassis are these aluminum chassis braces, and those were one of the parts that were sold with this chassis when I bought it, and I believe they were made by or sold by an eBay seller, because they look very similar to the aluminum chassis braces that several sellers on eBay have for sale all the time. And on top of the chassis braces are aluminum body mounts, both front and rear, and these aluminum body mounts were specifically made for the Bull Head, because you can see the Bull Head body mounts curve outward compared to the stock Clodbuster body mounts, which are straight. And the rear body mounts here are really short on the Bull Head, and these ones that I also bought from eBay were sold originally as Clodbuster body mounts for some reason. I think the seller on eBay didn't know that the Bull Head has shorter body mounts, but I actually bought these with a Clodbuster body mount set. But one thing I had to change on these is there was a lot of extra aluminum material right here on this one and right there on this one, and I had to machine these down using my Dremel rotary tool in order to get the Bull Head body to sit down flush on these body mounts. So there's a lot of extra material here, and that blocks the body from sitting down. So if I had an end mill, I could have done a much nicer job on those, but all I had was my Dremel rotary tool, and I just ground them down. Mounted on the side of this sassy chassis, aluminum tub chassis, is the stock Bull Head power and economy switch right here, and that turns on and off the ESC cooling fan now. So if I turn it on, there, you can see it turn on. So these are done just with switches, nothing fancy here. The other slide switch right here that normally controls the radio system on a stock Bull Head, I have that connected to the headlights and the fog lights right here. The headlights are on the body, so they're not shown right here, but there's the fog lights. Turn them off. And those are just standard Tamiya incandescent headlight kits in there. Both the ESC cooling fan and all of the lights are powered by 6 AA batteries that are located in these three AA battery holders right here. And these battery holders are old Radio Shack 2 AA battery holders, and they have nickel cadmium batteries in them right now for 7.2 volts of power going to the headlights and the cooling fan. And the Tamiya incandescent headlight kits are rated at only 7.2 volts, so cannot handle any more power than that, otherwise the light bulbs will burn out. And I chose these Radio Shack 2 AA battery holders because, first of all, I like them a lot. I use them also on Chernobog, my 6-wheel drive modified bullhead truck. And I also like them because they do not have a built-in on-off switch. Almost all 2 AA battery holders that I found today, modern ones, all have a slide switch on them, so I didn't need the extra switch since I have the chassis mounted on-off switch on this truck. And also, most of the modern 2 AA battery holders that I found for sale, they require you to slide in order to take the batteries in and out. You have to slide the top cover in that direction. And if you notice, there's not much room to do that with this front battery holder right here. Between the side chassis wall and the plastic cover for the battery holder, you just cannot slide it off. So one of the things that I really like about these Radio Shack battery holders is that to remove them, all you do is just take out this little Phillips head screw right there, and then you can lift the battery cover straight up. You don't have to slide it off. So that works great, especially for this one that's mounted here in the front of the chassis. For the ones mounted in the rear of the chassis, there's plenty of room here to slide it on and off. But I got lucky and I found an eBay seller that was selling these Radio Shack battery holders brand new, still in the package, so that's why I bought these ones. When I built Chernobog, they were still available because Radio Shack was still in business. But those were the good old days, as they say. Now, one of the things that I forgot to mention when I did the first video about this truck is that the steering system is controlled by a high-tech HS645MG steering servo mounted here. On that steering servo is a Kimbrough large servo saver right there, and the servo is mounted to an aluminum servo mount right there. And that's another one of the parts that came with this chassis when I bought it. And it looks like one of the servo mounts that are sold on eBay by several eBay sellers. I have other aluminum servo mount plates in Chernobog and in the ESP King Claude that I bought, and those were all from Pargu. And this one is a little bit different than those. The flat plate right here on this one is a little bit thinner, maybe about just a millimeter compared to the Pargu ones. So this one was not made by Pargu. I believe it is one of the eBay servo mounts. And also, one of the things that I forgot to mention in that first video about this truck is that the reason why I chose to use these hot racing internal spring shock absorbers on this truck is because of the top ESP quad shock mount plate right here. The mount plate is quite short. It's not very long from that side to that side, and also the 4 shock mounting holes are drilled very close together, so you need to use very skinny shock absorbers with this upper mount. And all shock absorbers that I've seen for either buggies or trucks, they are all too large in diameter to fit here. The shock caps and the shock bodies will actually hit each other right here. So if you look at the shocks that are on the ESP King Claude, which also uses an ESP quad shock mount kit. Those shocks are Duratrax Gold shocks, and there's hardly any space between them. Probably less than a millimeter clearance between some of the shocks on that truck. So anything larger than that, than those shocks, then they will not fit on this at all. And that's why I use the Hot Racing shocks, internal spring shocks, because they are some of the skinniest shocks that I could find available. And they fit here with just enough clearance between them. So I did not choose these for performance or anything like that. It's just basically they were some of the few shocks that will fit on these brackets. And the reason why I chose to use the 90 millimeter long shocks, because they make these in different lengths. Like there's 100 millimeter long ones, and the reason why I chose to use the 90 millimeter ones is because of the height of the quad shock mount plates. The top one here and the bottom one here. They are considerably taller than compared to when you use a stock bull head suspension system. So if I use stock length shocks, like 100 millimeter ones or 110 millimeter long shocks, that would cause just too much, would lift the suspension too much, and that would cause problems with the steering geometry, with these steering links right here being at too much of an angle there on the rear and also on the front. Now I could solve all that by mounting my steering servos on the front and rear gear cases, like what is on my Clodzilla 4 Gravedigger truck, but I've never liked the look of steering servos mounted on the gear cases, like in the front of a bullhead or a clodbuster. Got that big boxy servo on the front area right here. I've never liked the look of that, so I've always liked to have the steering servos just tucked away and out of view. But as far as performance, you cannot beat axle mounted servos for that reason. Just takes all that steering geometry problems and just they go away automatically when you mount your servos onto the gear cases. And while on the subject of gear cases, one of the things that I found out when this is the first truck that I have ever used Hot Racing aluminum gear cases and axle tubes on. If you look at all my other trucks, they use aluminum gear cases and axle tubes made by JPS. And JPS made really nice parts, but one of the things that I don't like about them is that the shape of them is just a little bit different compared to the stock Tamiya parts that they replace. And in particular, that applies to their axle tubes. The end of the Hot Racing axle tubes, in comparison, is very similar, if not identical, to the dimensions of the stock Tamiya plastic axle tubes. And the great thing about that is it allows you to mount the stock Tamiya steel axle stays right here and right there. The JPS axle tubes on the ends right there, there's not enough room on them to mount the axle stays. And as a result, if you look at all my trucks with the JPS parts on them, they do not have the axle stays on them. And I'm always a big fan of making your axles as strong as possible. And sure, the aluminum gear cases, the JPS gear cases with the JPS axle tubes, they're all made out of aluminum, so they're very strong, but in my opinion, it never hurts to have extra strength in your axle area of your bullhead or clodbuster. And with the JPS parts, that's just impossible to add these parts on, add the axle stays on them. But if you notice right here, the Hot Racing parts have no problem. The stock axle stays bolt on just like on the stock Tamiya plastic gear cases and plastic axle tubes. Just same thing, they just bolt right on there. So it never hurts to have extra support in that area, which is why I see all too often today lots of modified clodbusters and bullheads that have stock Tamiya gear cases with Hot Racing aluminum axle tubes bolted onto them without the axle stays in place. And that is a recipe for broken plastic gear cases. So if you never jump your truck, you probably will never have that problem, but I like to make my gear case and axle assemblies as strong as possible, so especially if I were running the stock plastic Tamiya axle tubes with aluminum, or excuse me, stock plastic Tamiya gear cases with aftermarket aluminum axle tubes, I absolutely would always put on the steel axle stays or any one of the aluminum aftermarket axle stays. Just adds extra strength there. But if you never jump your truck, then that's a problem that will never come up. And also, one thing that I mentioned regarding the ladder bars in my last video about this truck is I mentioned in the ladder bars that the JPS ladder bars have bushings in the ball joints right here, and I think I accidentally said that they were machined aluminum bushings, and they are not. They are machined plastic bushings in the JPS ladder bars, and that's why I like the JPS ladder bars the best. These are, as I mentioned in my first video, these are made by Pargu, and they do not have the machined plastic bushings in the ball joints right there. So just a little detail that I messed up on. One thing too, if you notice on this truck and on all of my trucks, I replace all of the hardware with stainless steel socket head cap screws. And that even includes like the self-tapping screws, like right here on the battery holders. And that's because I like how socket head cap screws are much harder to strip out. On the heads cannot be stripped out as easily as, say, Phillips heads or slotted head screws. And one of the things, while I'm on the subject of hardware, one of the things that I do not like about any of the hot racing parts that I bought is that hot racing, at least on the parts that I have from hot racing, they all have black oxide steel screws with them. And I'm not a big fan of black oxide screws because eventually they rust and look terrible. So if you notice on my truck here, all of the hot racing parts are bolted together with stainless steel hardware. And that includes the flat head screws right here on the shocks, and also the screws that hold the gear cases together, and also the kingpin screws for the steering knuckles right there. If you notice on the original kingpin screws that Hot Racing supplies are black oxide. I replaced mine with stainless steel. Right there, stainless steel shoulder screws. I found those at McMaster Car, by the way. And the black oxide screws that Hot Racing supplies with the gear cases, like right here and right there, originally they come with black oxide button head screws. And if you notice, I replaced mine with, just like everywhere else, I replaced mine with stainless steel socket head cap screws. And one of the things I don't like about 3mm button head screws, whether they're made out of black oxide steel or stainless steel, is that the button heads for some reason have smaller 2mm hex drives in them. And the socket head cap screws, the 3mm socket head cap screws like these, have a 2.5mm hex drive in them. And I have found through the years that the 2mm hex drives are much easier to strip out compared to the 2.5mm hex drives of the cap screws. So I don't know why that little 0.5 millimeter in the size of the hex drive, you wouldn't think it would make a big difference, but I have found that to be the case. I've never stripped out a 2.5mm hex drive on a socket head cap screw, whereas I have stripped out several 2mm hex drives in button head, 3mm button head screws through the years. So just, maybe it's just me, but I like to play it safe, so that's why although the socket head cap screws don't look as nice as the button heads on the gear cases, which is probably why Hot Racing provides button head screws. They kind of look nice and smoother, don't stick out as much as the cap screws, but I don't like stripped out screws at all, so I avoid that problem completely by using socket head, 3mm socket head cap screws everywhere on my gear cases. So those are some of the details of my Tamiya Bull Head that I call Raging Bull. Those are the details with the body removed. So if anyone has any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them below. And I will also, in the description, provide a link to my first video that I made about this truck in case you missed it. So I will catch you in the next video.